What once was noted as a career suicide by respected record executive Clive Davis would also be seen as a calculated risk worth taking by the global rock sensation Santana. Coming down from unimaginable career heights from their 1969 Woodstock performance and 3 consecutive albums titled Santana, Abraxas, and Santana 3, the group pushes past the depths of Afro-Latin rock through dedicated musicianship, sensuality, and spirituality. In 1972, they took a musical detour into spiritual jazz with the group's album, Caravanserai, as Michael Shreve and Carlos Santana believed this album would be a creative risk worth taking. This concept album would soon become the catalyst to their jazzy trilogy and continues to prove itself 50 years after its release. I'm Neva Wave, and you're listening to Sustenance and Sound B-Sides. When I initially started my crate digging journey, I kind of was pulling music from everywhere and anywhere. But I only was reintroduced to Santana's music because of my coworker, who was constantly playing it in our work office. And it wasn't until I decided to just kind of like crate dig on Afro-Latin music where I ended up finding Caravanserai's Closer, which is Every Step of the Way. A song that kind of stopped me in my tracks and had me questioning, oh my god, what the is this? And why haven't I heard it before? And I immediately just fell in love with the album after listening to it over and over and over again. And it was honestly the start of the journey of understanding how this album all came to be. Santana's 4th studio album, Caravanserai, was released October 11th, 1972. Before we could even get into the whole creative aspect of making this album, we gotta take a step back and understand Santana's origins. Carlos Santana states in his book, The Universal Tone, Bringing My Story to Light, that through their music, they wanted to exemplify 4 key components, and that is emotional expression, self-reliance, discipline. He wanted to make sure that they had a reason to continue to pursue music, but most importantly, improvisation over a classically trained performance that relied on the fundamentals of music. While initially this seemed to be the band's main focus all throughout the beginning of their career, once they reached to unbreakable heights, the band members were being introduced to a rockstar's lifestyle. They had everything at their disposal: women, vices, everything that you can imagine, because they were the guys. They were the guys who performed at Woodstock and did an amazing performance. But unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, because at the beginning of the 1970s was the death of rock. Many great rock legends that you would see perform at Woodstock, ranging from Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, and even Jimi Hendrix, they were all dying. And this was a wake-up call. On top of that, the idea of creating an album even better than the last was getting harder to top. And with the accessibility of drugs getting in the way of making good music, Santana wanted to go a different direction, especially once he started to get his hands on The Autobiography of a Yogi by Paramhansa Yogananda. But we'll get back to him in a second. This change in ideology didn't just take form in the way that they created their music, but also it picked up in different elements such as their style, their creative output, and also in the way that they chose songs to, in a sense, replicate for this album, which honestly kind of diverted the band into 2 different outlooks towards the band's future success. Initially, when Santana first came onto the scene, their bandmates incorporated Afro-Cuban and Hammond blues influences. Their albums would also have many contributors from music such as Latin jazz percussionist Willie Bobo Carrera, Gabor Zabazo, Jose Chapito Arias, and Armando Pereza. But as they started to work on the 4th album, Carlos and Michael Shreve experimented with Latin jazz, spiritual jazz, and transcendental rock when making Caravanserai. While Santana had very bluesy origins, pulling from the great Aretha Franklin to Nina Simone to Elvin Jones, you would start to see this huge shift into jazz music, largely in part because of Michael Shreve, because he introduced to Santana new jazz music, on top of Santana's pre-existing love and appreciation for Miles Davis. So Michael Shreve ended up showing Carlos Santana John Coltrane, Alice Coltrane, Pharoah Sanders with his song Themby off of Astral Traveling, Herbie Hancock's Crossing, and Carlos Santana started to become inspired by John McLaughlin from the Mahav Ishnu Orchestra. And mind you, these are some of the few artists that Carlos Santana and Michael Shreve were listening to at the time because they were influenced by so many other people. Could you imagine just seeing these two guys listening to some of the greatest jazz players? These were the foundational blocks, the fundamentals that help with Caravanserai. And it's just interesting to see how it all played out. But now, let's revisit Yogananda's philosophy real quick. The diverse melting pot of San Francisco was crazy about two things, and that was new music and Yogananda's autobiography. Because in part, it primarily focused on achieving enlightenment through self-realization, after going through multiple cycles of life and finally reaching that happiness that not one person could ever achieve if they never went on this journey. Carlos would recall Yogananda's influential quote that made such a large impact on him. The caravan is an eternal cycle of reincarnation, every soul going in and out of life and back again until you arrive at a place where you could rest and reach inner peace. That place is the Caravanserai. Carlos can really resonate with Yogananda's wise words. It's almost as if every sense of reality is interconnected with oneself of the world, and understanding that life is one but not separate helps one achieve happiness. And I think it's beautifully put. So that was the main focus of the album. It's meant to show the true meaning of happiness, which starts by challenging yourself to evolve into the person you're meant to be. It requires a person to rationalize their thoughts and actions through meditation until they reach the liberating peak where worldly possessions no longer constrict them from achieving their final form. Ultimately, it's a matter of being self-aware enough to take action. So the combination of the ode to jazz and Eastern philosophy really shimmer through on their fourth album. But I think the most important thing to get from this is that Carlos Santana wasn't the only one going on this spiritual journey. As I've mentioned, John McLaughlin and Alice Coltrane would be some of the influences that would help the band Santana reach what they were looking for spiritually, but also through the music as well. Because they were all on a spiritual journey. Two random side notes. So initially when Carlos met John McLaughlin, he connected Carlos to Sri Chinmoy, who contributed to Santana's spiritual direction in life, but also towards the album as well. He would continue this journey for maybe, I think, a decade before he felt like, you know what, things are kind of fishy in here. It's almost like an alleged cult.
You don't find that suspicious? You don't find that suspicious?
I'm gonna just step back, practice on my own. But of course, that's a story for another day when we start to review the lives of some of these musicians. And secondly, Carlos and Alice Coltrane would work together to create an album called Illuminations. They would change their names to Turiya and Devadip, and they created spiritual and Eastern sounding music for the masses. Unfortunately, wasn't doing too well commercially, but if you ever get a chance because you're curious about it, you're interested in listening to their music, feel free to check it out. I'd love to know your thoughts. Go ahead and leave them down in the comments, and make sure to like and subscribe for future videos. But with a lot of these jazz artists that Michael Shreve and Carlos Santana were listening to, what they really wanted to capture for this album was the loose spiritual rhythms that you could find in jazz music. Music not constrained by definitive music style, but it pulls and embeds from noteworthy sounds into this genre, leaving room for much appreciated meditative sounds and improvisation along the way. So between the journey of spiritual jazz and Yogananda's practices, you'll start to see how they both intersect with each other to reach a level of inner peace, or to show somebody finding inner peace within the music making process. An extremely profound concept, but considering that every album used to have meaning represented in everything that they did, from the artwork or from the lyrics, the track placement, everything had some connection or some meaning to it, it kind of makes sense. And I mean, Caravanserai was no exception to the rule. I mean, take a look at the album cover, for God's sake. They literally have a camel in the desert. Which was all made possible by Joan Chase, an artist and animationist responsible for working on a couple of Santana's album covers. Carlos's intent when creating the album cover was to basically capture camels traveling as high noon approaches a burning, blazing, bright sun. And it's supposed to represent the traveling to that resting place. And thus, the 10-song masterpiece would be created and finished by the time that 1972 rolled around. The album starts off with track 1, Eternal Caravan of Reincarnation, which opens up with recognizable crickets, ethereal vamp, before leading into waves within. Track 2 sounds pretty comparable to something that the Mahavishnu Orchestra would create, with the screaming, riffing guitar and sustained organ keys, but heavier percussion in lieu of strings. Next you have track 3, Look Up to See What's Coming Down, which brings back that 70s sound with the wah-wah guitar, funk bass, and it closes with a harmony shared between the organ and percussion before smoothly transitioning into Just in Time to See the Sun. This song has a comparable drum pattern to the jazz standard Afro Blue by Mongo Santamaria that flows into one of the only 3 songs with lyrics on the album. Track 5, Song of the Wind, is an instrumental vamp for Santana to lay his sweet, sappy sounding guitar solo all over the song. Following that, you have track 6, which is All the Love of the Universe, and castanets fill the air to open and close the song. But the meat of the song is an electrifying instrumental solo, with all the band members playing profusely together. Up next, you'll have their song Future Primitive, which is a dissonant sounding song with fast-paced congas and timbales. Once the song ends, we're met with Stoneflower, which, fun fact, was written by Michael Shreve while he was high off acid. But also, this was an adaptation to Antonio Carlos Jobim's song of the same title. The striking ode included lyrics and an instrumental twist. This adaptation opens up with Arabic sounds paired with an upright bass, a descending riffing guitar, and you'll also hear the Brazilian monkey drum before completely replicating the same sound found on Jobim's original. In a recent interview with Jazz Is magazine, Michael Shreve would describe the process of creating this adaptation as something comparable to a story from Nat King Cole, where he used the lyrics of a homeless man to create his own song. The main theme to pull from this story is that music creation comes in the form of sharing ideas from one person to a group of people, which is something that's commonly seen in jazz. As we get closer to the end of the album, we're introduced with La Fuente del Ritmo, which literally translates to the fountain of rhythm, which is embraced by heavy percussion. But finally, we are at my favorite song, which is track 10, Every Step of the Way. It combines elements from each song to create something with progressive transitions, heavy percussion, a roller coaster of melodic guitar picking alongside Hammond organ keys. It is an extremely climactical song that transposes into different time signatures. There's an Afro-Cuban style bass line that repeats the same notes throughout the song, never stopping, not even when a fiery flute solo is added to the mix. And the song closes with swelling horns before being layered with a string section. I'm telling you, you need to look at the material. And by the end of it, the album left them feeling courageous. They were proud of their work, and why shouldn't they be? They spent a lot of time and hours carefully studying from the great jazz musicians of their time, going deeper into what they were trying to achieve with this specific album, and it was everything that they were looking for. Now, you know you can't please everybody when you make an album. Either you please the fans, you please the record label, or you please the artist, yourself. This was an album that definitely pleased the artist, but I'd say it was a mixed bag when it came to the public's perception and when it came to the record label. As previously mentioned, Columbia's Clive Davis strongly suggested that this album was career suicide. It was overly experimental, not blues heavy, and no big radio singles. It might have even been noted that Carlos' dissociation from the rock rebel image had started to slowly tip over the edge into something that was too out there for general audiences. So this would become the start of Santana's quote-unquote many career suicide albums, where he basically took the time to embrace the unknown and unpredictability of the band's music. Besides, this was a moment where they were proud of their creation. Even Carlos Santana notes this as slices of life, not songs. So they already viewed it in a different sense. And to add on to that, this album was meant to be a gift to their former rock promoter, Bill Graham, who was a major contributing factor for putting them onto many gigs, including Woodstock, but also a gift to Clive Davis as well. So it was more than just music. And on top of that, it was supposed to be a statement to prevent the group from becoming just another band, chewed up and spat out by Hollywood's circle after being introduced to drugs and the chaos amid their climb to fame. So after the group confronted the record label with their interpretation of what the album means to them, it was released. Reflecting back to 1972, the album did relatively well, riding off the highs of Santana's former releases, as this album would chart on Billboard's R&B and Top 200 charts for more than 30 weeks, where they would also receive a platinum status. But this would be the start of the decline of Santana's overall commercial success. And in part, it was because of the tensions bubbling up within the group and the new spiritual musical directions that Santana decided to take with the band. David Brown would become too preoccupied to continue to practice with the band, so he would soon be replaced by his understudies Doug Ranch and Tom Riley. Michael Carabello would also leave the band to settle an ultimatum placed by Santana because of the musical differences between Carabello and Santana.
I'm the one selling the records. They coming to see me.
They coming to see the Temptations.
Ain't nobody coming to see you, Otis.
After unsuccessfully leaving Santana behind for their upcoming tour, he took it as a moment to reflect and pursue his own ventures. And he would be replaced by Armando Pereza and Mingo Lewis. Lastly, former co-founder Greg Rowley, who wasn't too fond of the musical change that Santana would undergo, he decided to start his own band called Journey, and he would too be replaced by Tom Coster. And while it's a bitch to kind of figure out what you're gonna do with the band next, trying to fill in new bandmates and whatnot, it's even a bigger one when you gotta go on a huge world tour where you're hitting almost every continent except Africa and Antarctica. So there they were, riding in their little private jet, and when I say private, I literally mean they had a private jet. And the first stop was in Europe. And to be completely honest, this album had better perception in Europe and in Canada because there was already a resurgence of jazz in those countries. The free jazz movement kicked off in the early 1960s and was revolutionized by Ornette Coleman, as described by The Atlantic in 1961. It was a structureless avant-garde style of jazz, which was more appreciated internationally compared to in the US. And it was definitely heavy on improvisation and self-expression. This style of music wasn't embraced by American society because it played outside the music norms of classical jazz and was commonly played amongst African American musicians during the civil rights movement. So in some sense, there was some racial bias towards the genre as well. But upon returning to the US, the San Francisco locations that Santana played at had smaller crowds than they were expecting, but they still received standing ovations. But the whole idea of the Woodstock Santana kept resurfacing in different locations when they would perform. For instance, once they went down to the American South, the crowd wanted blues, not whatever the hell this was. It was to the point where they were literally yelling at the band Santana as they played during their set to play blues. But as soon as they finished their America tour, they went overseas to perform for Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get any footage or reviews from the New Zealand or Australian performances, but the Japan performance looks pretty fucking badass. The last stop on their touring list was Latin America, This was the home to Carlos and percussionist Chipito, so it was almost like a reunion where they were embraced by some of their biggest fans from home, and they were excited to perform their newest album, something that they were proud to share. However, their fans were expecting the Woodstock hysteria that they had just missed by a couple of years. The fans in Latin America were basically trying to recapture the idea of the free love movement and free marijuana, of course. Unfortunately, it ended up being one of the more scarier tours, where they received negative press in Venezuela and Colombia because the crowd came joints ablazing, and also 2 unexpected deaths. So the overall album almost didn't meet to the expectations that the fans were looking for. Eventually, a couple years later down the line, the album would soon receive its accolades from the Rolling Stone magazine, where it praised Santana's change by saying, instead of the hard-edged, almost frantic stomp of the previous Santana, there's much more emphasis on the romantic, lyrical, and celebration-evoking sound. But the Latin excitement is still there. So this album was really for people who are willing to give the new Santana a chance. The new Santana didn't even stop there. Caravanserai and its trilogy albums were supposed to represent the journey of enlightenment, where you'll see that Caravanserai was supposed to represent Earth and Ascension. Their follow-up album, Welcome, was supposed to be that ascending process before the final album to the trilogy, Por Boleta, is to represent the return from the Ascension trip. This concept album and its successors was a trip that continues to last a lifetime. And in a 2022 interview, you could definitely see the impact that Caravanserai had on Michael Shreve and Carlos Santana. Santana says he appreciates this album no more than the band's other creations when interviewing for NPR's All Songs Considered podcast. But it still stands as a bittersweet memory when he listens to this album, because it was a moment where the band created something without the OG members. And while it has been decades, it still lingers on him today. As for Michael Shreve, he recalls it as being sucked back into the majestic world of making this 4th album. With Caravanserai, Santana has showed that a risk could be a successful one, based on how you truly view success. And this album became a success to Carlos Santana when he got to share these slices of life with the remainder of the world. So whether you're a Woodstock fan, a Supernatural fan, or you just happen to buy his fedora at age 11. Okay, don't hate, you know fedoras were cool in 2013. Check out Santana's discography, because you too would transcend on a captivating spiritual journey that you just won't want to miss. Thanks for tuning in on my first video. I'm really excited to talk about different and new artists, so let me know who you're listening to down below. Make sure to keep up with me on Instagram and Twitter, and I'll see you next time on Sustenance and Sound B-Side.